Thank you very much. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I am speaking today from the tribal lands of the Husek, and I offer this paper in recognition of and atonement for the role played by my own distant ancestors in the extirpation of the Skokomish, Suquamish, Puyallup, and other hereditary inhabitants of the region about which I'm speaking. And I offer this paper in memory of Bruce Phillips. At the close of the Gilded Age, when it seemed as if monopolistic corporatism or militaristic imperialism might take over the world, small cadres of workers in the Pacific Northwest used street song to battle for the right to organize. In towns like Seattle, Tacoma, Everett, and Spokane, dock and lumber workers, many of them European immigrants, led by the industrial workers of the world, developed a particularly rich repertoire of noise-driven public strategies. When mine and mill owners sent Salvation Army brass bands to play to drown out IWW street corner speakers, wobbly songwriters supplied new contrafact texts to be sung in defiance of the competing band's music, thereby exploiting the power of massed song, no less than that of massed bodies. In this paper, drawing upon a larger project mapping noise, dance, and music as tools of subaltern resistance, I examined the pre-World War I free speech fights and the songs that accompanied them. In the wake of 21st century up-from-below street activism, an understanding of the role that rebellious noise, and song most specifically, played in shaping 20th century civil rights tactics, in turn helps us contextualize the history of North American sonic revolution. Throughout the 19th century and into the Progressive Era, the accelerated pace of urbanization and industrialization raised the ambient sound level of North American cities and directly implicated social tensions around immigration's impact upon cities' soundscapes. By 1900, political authorities and their cultural arbiters were conflating unregulated public noise with the uncontrolled public presence of especially immigrant bodies, most notoriously in various cities' public campaigns against the cries of street vendors, who often were, or at least presumed to be, immigrants. Quote, directing regulatory concern to noisy occupations and subgroups encouraged insidious forms of cultural bias to gain purchase on certain persons and landscapes. It permitted biased cultural preferences to creep into the law and the idealized body politic that the law constructed and listened for. Oral scrutiny and policing would remain a powerful mechanism in future determinations of permissible attributes of public culture so important in shaping the character of the nation. End quote. In roughly the same period, however, labor activists and strikers led by the industrial workers of the world developed a particularly rich repertoire of song-based public resistance strategies. Contrafacts supplied by wobbly songwriters like Joe Hill drew on a rich tradition not only of earlier labor organizations, but also upon the historical practice of laying new texts upon known melodies' semiotic meanings, from Yankee Doodle to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. In the case of the IWW, this practice is the origin, for example, of Joe Hill's The Preacher and the Slave. Wobbly street corner orators likewise learned to deliver entire stump speeches analyzing labor versus capital at a machine gun pace that avoided violating time limits on public speech. This is Bruce Phillips.
Those old organizers were great street speakers. There were no sound systems. They were given the task, mainly working stiffs up out of the mines, off the wheat harvest, out of the logging camps, had set themselves to the task of standing on windy street corners and exhorting, polemicizing, waving their arms, windmilling it was called, and getting people to walk over the street from, instead of being gathered around the Starvation Army band that was Bible banging and Jesus preaching and telling these working folks if they give what they had to the Lord, they get pie in the sky by and by, tried to get them to cross over the street and listen and join a fighting union and change the condition of their lives, the condition of their labor. Of course, they had to talk pretty loud and they had to talk pretty fast because you didn't know when the cops were going to show up. I'll give you an example of what that street speaking was like. Here's a street oration from old San Francisco Phil Melman. Fellow workers, the industrial workers of the world are going to organize the entire working class. What is the working class, fellow workers? Why, the working class is anybody who's got a boss and works for wages. You got a boss and you're working for wages. Doesn't matter if you're a college professor or a ditch digger, you're in the working class and better be proud of it. Why, the middle class is just a joke made up by the bosses to keep us fighting against each other. Now, the industrial workers of the world is going to organize the working class into one big union of all skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled workers in one big union, the OBU. We've got the OBU, we'll have a general strike. Strike like that will last about half an hour. Then we're going to take this thing apart and put it together so it makes more sense with the means of the production in the hands of the producers, produce for use instead of profit, create abundance for workers and nothing for parasites. Thank you.
Convened in opposition to the tiered and divided organizations and close cooperation with major industries, which were undertaken by the American Federation of Labor, which had been founded in 1886. In contrast to Samuel Gompers's AFL, the Wobblies explicitly disavowed trade-specific membership, explicitly permitted the enrollment of unskilled workers, women, and people of color, and imbued their rhetoric, strategy, and street tactics throughout with a voluble and articulate expression of economic analysis under the general heading of anarcho-syndicalism. Borrowing lessons supplied particularly by Scandinavian and Southeast European immigrant members, they were explicitly Marxist and anti-authoritarian, and their willingness to engage in direct action, including acts of sabotage, street resistance, and extra-legal confrontation, made them both visible to workers across industries and a particular target of late Gilded Age oligarchic violence. While immigrant organizers of Italian and Eastern European background were central to organizing garment and manufacturing trades on the eastern seaboard, where speakers like Emma Goldman and Carlo Tresca cut their rhetorical teeth, immigrant and ethnic Scandinavians and indigenous people like Joe Hill and Frank Little were particular leaders in the mining and especially the labor and lumber industries of the West and the Pacific Northwest. Drawing upon the interplay of roles and experience between lumber workers and wandering hobos, the latter of whom were often simply workers bumming the rails between jobs or going to the next, the Wobblies used hobos' subterranean cultural networks and lingo to engage in conscious and active political education and organizing. Within a few weeks of the One Big Union's formal convention in Chicago in 1905, where ex-miner and leader Big Bill Haywood famously opened the proceedings by saying, "Fellow workers, this is the Continental Congress of the Working Class," mining, railroad, and timber barons were already seeking to activate federal and particularly state governments against such organizing, which they rightly recognized to present a potent threat to what the Wobblies themselves called capital. Throughout the postbellum period of industrial expansion, the barons had managed to find ways to exploit racist and nativist sentiments amongst American-born workers, and especially farmers, against the inclusion of blacks, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants into prototypical trade unions like the Knights of Labor. Exploiting such biases and stoking fears about job competition and job loss, the barons had successfully managed to prevent cross-trade union organizing. The Wobblies thus represented a particular threat, precisely because they rejected AFL-style trade specialization or rank and were willing to admit members regardless of race, ethnicity, or employment status. They likewise understood the power of direct street action and were unafraid of physical confrontation, arrest, or imprisonment. They were, in short, hard men and women who understood hard work and who were unabashed in their explicit, intentional, conscious, incisive, and radically confrontational political analysis. Moreover, they understood the psychology of community building and of sharing courage, and performance in speech, song, lyric, and print was an essential and highly effective part of their tactical arsenal. Quote, "It's the first strike I ever saw that sang. I shall not forget the curious lift, the strange, sudden fire of the mingled nationalities at the strike meetings when they broke into the universal language of song. And not only at the meetings did they sing, but in the soup houses and in the streets. They have a whole book of songs fitted to familiar tunes, the 8-hour song, the banner of labor, Workers, shall the masters rule us. But the favorite of all was the Internationale.
Debout les donnes de la terre, debout les forces de la faim. La raison tourne au centre, la terre, c'est l'éruption de l'enfer. Tout passé fait entendre le hasard, l'esclave debout, debout. Le monde va changer de base, nous ne sommes rien, soyons.
By 1909, the year that the IWW began publishing The Industrial Worker, the Wobblies had enrolled 30,000 members nationwide, and had likewise become quite sophisticated at identifying target cities in which especially egregious financial exploitation and unconstitutional municipal ordinances presented opportunities for confrontation, a lesson learned from the Wobblies by later civil rights activists, the anti-Vietnam movement, gay liberation, and the anti-nukes movement. This was especially true in the free speech fights from that year of 1909 amongst the timber trade workers of Everett and Spokane, Washington. Wobblies organized a campaign which targeted what they called job sharks, that is, third-party agents who set themselves up as contract representatives for major timber corporations, claiming to be able to find unemployed workers jobs through the payment of a finder's fee. In fact, the sharks were in business with the corporations to over-recruit applicants in excess of the available positions, thus exploiting competition to drive down wages. Wobbly organizers who denounced precisely this sort of wage slavery inaugurated an anti-shark campaign in Spokane in 1909 under the slogan, "Don't Buy Jobs," and the arrest of organizers began almost instantly thereafter. But in contrast to other unions and many other political factions, the Wobblies were unafraid of arrests and understood that their sheer strength of numbers and willingness to, in the parlance of later civil rights resistance, put their bodies on the line, actually gave them the capacity to choke and overload an unjust legal system. When the Spokane and Fresno community governments rewrote laws on public speaking, essentially criminalizing street corner oratory, the Wobblies perfected the means of intentionally accelerating arrests in order to overcrowd jails and bankrupt city governments. Quote, "They would go in a group to the designated corner, usually located in down-and-out districts teeming with unemployed youth. Setting up their boxes and watching for other activity, particularly that of evangelicals like the Salvation Army or the Holy Rollers, the Wobblies awaited an opportunity to put on their show. Parody and irreverence were the Wobbly trademarks. Song, the announcement of their presence. Once the crowd was drawn to the theater, the soapboxer began, loosening up the street gathering with words, gestures, and humor before delivering the message of revolution." End quote. Thus, even before the martyred bard Joe Hill authored The Preacher and the Slave in 1911, Wobblies and their political predecessors were already using songs and collections of songs, usually in the form of small cards or bound pamphlets of contrafact rewrites to familiar tunes, as organizing tools. J. H. Walsh, the ringleader of the so-called Overalls Brigade at the 1908 IWW convention in Chicago, had pioneered the collection of such texts into the hip pocket-sized, Marxist red-covered pamphlet called Songs to Fan the Flames of Discontent, otherwise the Little Red Songbook. Quote, "Walsh initiated the practice of singing IWW parodies of Salvation Army hymns to draw crowds away from the Sallies and toward IWW speakers nearby. It was Walsh, too, who formed the first IWW band. IWW street singing in competition with the Salvation Army proved even more effective than the Spokane IWWs had hoped. As a fellow worker observed at the time, it's really surprising how soon a crowd will form in the street to hear a song in the interest of the working class, familiar as they are with the model and sentimental music of the various religionists." First published in the 1908 edition of the Little Red Songbook, an anonymous contrafact on the William B. Mackey hymn Revive Us Again, later recorded in a variant by Harry McClintock, captures precisely the sly wit that encouraged mass singing in the teeth of police batons and Salvation Army brass.
Rejoice and be glad, for the springtime has come. We can throw down our shovels and go on the bum. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a hand out to revive us again. The springtime has come, and I'm just out of jail. without any money, without any bail. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. I went to a house and I rapped on the door, and the lady says, "Bum, bum, you've been here before." Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. I like Jim Hill, he's a good friend of mine. That is why I am hiking down Jim Hill's main line. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. I went to a house and I asked for some bread, and the lady says, "Bum, bum, the baker is dead." Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again. Why don't you work like other men do? Now how can I work when there's no work to do? Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again.
The IWW's apotheosis came just before and during the U.S. entry into World War I in 1917, recognizing, as labor has always done, that capital would only provide concessions like the 8-hour day or workers' compensation. When capital itself was strapped for labor, there was debate amongst wobbly leadership over whether cardholders should even fight the capitalists' war. Retaliation came swiftly in the political and legal retrenchments that would similarly confront civil rights activists after World War II. Joe Hill was arrested on false evidence and convicted of murder in Utah and executed by firing squad in 1915. In 1916, 300 Wobblies who traveled from Seattle via steamship were fired upon at the Everett docks by 200 citizen deputies of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department. In 1917, war opponent and Wobbly leader Frank Little was lynched in Butte, Montana. In 1918, mass trials against Wobblies conspiring to hinder the draft drew convictions and sentences of 20-plus years. And during 1919's Red Summer, federal restrictions on anti-draft and other seditious speech drastically accelerated the criminalization of labor organizing and the arrest and or deportation of labor activists. By the time of the notorious 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, when white mobs and black-robed Knights of Liberty bombed, shot, and strafed black civilians and burned the black business district of Greenwood, Oklahoma, IWW themselves were falsely accused, rather like the Antifa of a later era, of having fomented the violence, and the one big union was coming apart at the seams. But the Little Red Songbook and the wobbly tradition of singing as part of direct action continued, and it shaped the activities of international members who fought in Spain, members who organized aboard Liberty ships, and in a resurgence whose regional resonance in some ways brings us full circle today, members who took part in the World Trade Organization protests in 1999, and in the teeth of capital's opposition, in 2004 successfully inaugurated a company-wide union for Seattle's own Starbucks chain. What the free speech fights of pre-World War I Pacific Northwest wobbly activism tell us is a story of the criminalization of legitimate protest, specifically of protest by underclass activists who the dominant culture conceives to be undeserving of constitutional rights. Conversely, of dominant culture's legalization of extrajudicial and paramilitary murder to suppress formerly legal protest, and also of the power of revolutionary singing in the street to push back and seek justice.
To clear what has been an entirely
Everything
peaceful
old
protest.
is new again.
Not 98%, not 99%,
Everything wrong
but
before
100% peaceful protest here today.
still
People throwing, there was no throwing of water bottles, there was no throwing of objects, but a short time ago, mounted police officers have been clearing